What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is a complete guide on how to squat and also how to coach a squat, or better yet, how to individualize a squat. I think there's a lot of how to squat videos on the internet, and a lot of them give a lot of lip service to this idea of individualized squat form, but I don't think they actually have the adequate frameworks to equip people with so they can probably individualize their squat, whether it's for their body shape or whether it's for their particular goals that they're using a squat to train for. Because with all the different body shapes and different squatting abilities out there, there's definitely a lot of noise when it comes to, what is the most effective way to squat, or what are the big rocks of a squat actually, and then what's sort of the noise and what are the things that are just happening less consequentially around that. So we're going to start off with the actual 3 big rocks of a squat, and then we're going to go into a tier under that and look at the finer details. I have a background not just in strength sports such as Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting. I've also worked with general population and athletes in a whole variety of sports, so I can confidently say that this squat guide, no matter how you are built or no matter what squat you are using to train for any squat related goal, this guide will be helpful for you. And if you're coaching other people with their squat, even more important that you watch all the way through this video, and you should probably also check out my course links down below, like GPP Level 1. All right, let's get into it. Actually, before we get into the 3 big rocks of squat technique, I just want to talk a little bit more generally about different types of squats, squat depth, and technique optimization in general. So the reason we optimize lifting technique is not for injury prevention or any real safety reasons. It's really just a case of trying to find the most efficient positions that work for the lifter and help them squat for their goals. So pretty much any reasonable, and again, please use some common sense here, any reasonable squat technique is probably going to be safe because humans are incredibly adaptable. So if we just focus on efficiency and then a responsible dose of training, your body will adapt to almost any squat technique. And you would be surprised, there are a lot of people's squats that do not pass the eye test, but they're incredibly strong and resilient squatters. So if you want to be a weapon of a coach, or you're just trying to optimize a squat for your own individual needs, it is important to keep an open mind with certain things. Some of those things that people get way too caught up in as well is what type of squat you do. Unless you are competing in a specific strength sport, the type of squat you do, whether it's even a barbell squat or a machine squat, let alone where you choose to put the barbell, it's almost completely arbitrary. Another thing that's totally up to you if you don't compete in a strength sport is how low you squat. So you could definitely make an argument that there's a correct or incorrect level of depth for your goals, but especially once you factor in the different reasons why people might be doing a squat exercise, so many different squat depths are valid. But even if you are a powerlifter, it doesn't necessarily mean that the low bar squat is the only squat you should be interested in. I think that's a good enough segue into our first big rock of squatting, which is bar placement. Bar placement is one of the biggest influences on squat technique and making sure that you're doing the right sort of squat for either your goals or your body type or your current limitations. Now we can easily break this down into 2 categories for bar placement. We have our anteriorly loaded squats and our posteriorly loaded squats, but then there's lots of subcategories or variations within that. For example, we have a Zercher squat, holding the bar in front of us in the crooks of our elbows. We have a zombie squat with the bar resting on our collarbones and our arms also as a counterbalance. Then we have the classic front squat like an Olympic weightlifter. Then we have our high bar back squat where the bar is resting on our traps, and it's sort of, the most classic or stereotypical version of a barbell back squat. And then we have we won't really be talking about mid bar today because you can work that out for yourself, but then low bar, which is the powerlifter style squat with the barbell sort of resting on the shelf created by the rear delts. And so the general rule with all of these anteriorly loaded squat variations is they help you stay a little bit more upright, and they give you a great counterbalance for anyone who struggles with getting to full depth in a squat. And then as we start to put the bar not just on our back, but also further down our back, we have to start embracing a little bit more forward lean, and this is going to make us hit depth or get that nice rebound a little bit higher. So that's why powerlifters really like it, because they don't want to squat deeper than they have to. So by leaning forward, they can make their squat a little bit more like a deadlift. And one of the reasons is it's a little bit easier to manage the range of motion. I just want to give an extra shout out to Zercher squats as well, because it's basically like it fixes everything that's wrong with goblet squats. Goblet squats used to be my go-to for teaching the squat pattern just because it's a moderate load, really easy for people to counterbalance, but then it becomes useless really quick as soon as people get strong. A Zercher squat is so similar to a goblet squat, but you're not limited by the amount of load that you can hold to get that great counterbalance effect. And it's also not like a front squat in the sense that you have to have some pretty good shoulder and wrist mobility. You can get the most immobile people squatting really deep and quite heavy, just with a really nice Zercher setup. And it's also one of the best ways to introduce people to that little bit more protracted shoulder position. It's going to set them up later for a really good front rack. So Zerches just get you to open up at the back a little bit more rather than having to create a shelf for the bar on your back. And so this is where there is a subtle relationship between bar placement and bracing as well, which is another one of our big rocks, which we'll be discussing in a second. This isn't always the case, but generally speaking, more anteriorly loaded squats, we embrace a little bit more flexion of the trunk, and then more posteriorly loaded squats, they encourage a little bit more extension of the trunk or the spine. So we have this typical rule of anteriorly loaded squats kind of assisting us with the mobility demands of squatting, but then not being as good for lifting absolute load. Often, if we want to maximize absolute load, we have to look into more posteriorly loaded variations. But this is where, if you're not a power lifter, you're probably squatting for more than just one reason. Like one of the reasons I squat for general S&C, yes, I want to build big, strong legs, but I also want to use it a little bit to maintain some mobility. So that's why for me, I like a lot of heavy front squats because I can still load them heavy enough, but I still get really great range of motion as well. So this is where hopefully you can see I'm giving you all of these continuums and you can optimize all of this stuff, whether it's for your goals or just making the squat more comfortable for your body type. One of the myths I want to bust about bar placement is that I think a lot of people, I often hear them say that not just posteriorly loaded squats, but especially low bar squats are better for people with longer femurs. I don't think that's true. All it's allowing you to do is hinge your squat, which is really good for your goals if you're a power lifter. But if you're using, it doesn't matter how long your femurs are, if you're using it for quad development, you still need a relatively squatty squat with a lot of forward knee travel. So that's where I think anteriorly loaded squats are just as useful for long femur people as they are short femur people. I think there's more important things that influence where you put the bar than how long your femurs are. So I've already mentioned two of our three big rocks, bar placement and also bracing. But before I talk about bracing, because I do want to stick to talking about them in the order that you should be thinking about them. So after we've figured out where we want to put the bar, then we need to think about our foot position. And so there's four main variables we want to consider when it comes to foot position. These are stance width, toe angle, heel elevation, and foot pressure. So ultimately, to optimize all these four variables that underpin the ideal foot position, you should just experiment with the full continuum of both of them. So with stance width, like, yeah, sure, there's certain hip structures and body shapes that are more prone to being a little bit more comfy or being stronger with a narrower stance width. But like, it's just so easy to experiment with a wide stance width and then bring it in really narrow and try every single variation in between until you find one that feels really natural for you. You may also notice that within those four variables, there are trade-offs between all of them as well. So you might notice that you can trade off stance width for toe angle. So if you're someone who has historically felt better with a wider stance width, but for some reason you want to change that, you could try bringing your stance in, but then just turning your feet out a little bit, or vice versa. Heel elevation is another one. So a lot of people, you might not be able to get as deep unless you bring your feet out a little bit wider, but then you might find that if you elevate your heels, you can actually squat deeper with a narrower stance and with your feet pointing straight ahead. As a general rule, when you're having trouble getting deeper, you want slightly wider stance, slightly more turned out feet, slightly more heel elevation. This isn't always the case, but generally that's the rule. Whereas if you're more interested in typically either more force production or just limiting the range of motion a little bit more, this is where typically people explore narrower stances, less heel elevation, and a little bit straighter of a toe angle. Another interesting thing about these, I described it as a continuum, and I was like, typically wider stance helps with depth. Like when you start to get to the extremes of these continuums, sometimes the rule starts to go the other way. My power clean catch is a really good example of this. So yes, if I go this narrow, I struggle to hit depth. If I go a little bit wider, then my depth gets better. But then if I go really wide, that starts to limit my depth as well. So this is why I Spider-Man my power clean catches, because it starts to get so heavy. If I catch it right at parallel at this stance, it's so easy for me to sink all the way down. Whereas if I just throw my feet out, I can't squat deeper than parallel like this. Another consideration about heel elevation is it's really like adding salt or MSG to a dish. A little bit goes a long way, especially if you don't own a pair of weightlifting shoes and you're just using these gym wedges that you see, and this is a great tool to use for a lot of people in the gym. But for the perfect squat, it's honestly too much heel elevation for a lot of people. These thin chain plates, however, this is much more representative of the actual amount of heel elevation that you'll get in a weightlifting shoe, like a Nike Romaleo or something. So even though these might look a little bit pretty or sexier, I actually think these change plates, they're often the sweet spot for a lot of people, just to get enough of that sort of counterbalancing ability, right? Think about when you're walking downhill, you get a little bit squattier. That's all you're doing by raising the heel elevation. It's almost like the stance width thing. When you really elevate someone into this stiletto position, all my weight's in my toes, and I feel like my calves are really stiff, and I just almost want to do like this really hingy squat. So a little bit of heel elevation, or even if I sort of come down a little bit flatter on these, I get a really squatty squat. Or sorry, let's go foot flat. A lot of people will squat very hingy, a little bit of heel elevation. We're in the sweet spot of maximizing the squattiness, massive amount of heel elevation. We're back to that sort of hingy pattern again. And now for our final big rock of squat technique, we're gonna talk all things bracing. Now bracing, we break down into two subcategories, which is breathing or Valsalva technique, and then how flexed or extended our spine or axial skeleton position is. A lot of people will talk about the relationship between your pelvis and your rib cage. I think it's also important to consider things like head position and then the load placement sort of inclusive of all that as well. I think bracing is something that's dramatically overcomplicated by a lot of strength coaches out there or content creators. And honestly, just speaking from my own coaching perspective, I would say it's something that's historically been overemphasized as well, as far as the importance of just bracing as hard as possible. I think for a lot of people, bracing as hard as possible is a really good strategy. I think there are a lot of people that could benefit from trying to brace a little bit harder, especially if you've never really nailed that intensity of brace. But I've also been collecting a lot of anecdotal evidence from very experienced high-level, national, international level powerlifters who are saying that they're enjoying a slightly less aggressive brace on their squats these days. And so that's not to say that bracing isn't important. Just like everything else, the amount and the way you do it is highly individualized. The general goal of our brace is to just maintain whatever position we start the squat with, so we can efficiently transfer force from our legs into the bar, which is on our back or in our arms or on our collarbones. But the thinking is that a relatively stiff torso is beneficial for that transfer of force through the system. Sorry, one other thing to mention about bracing is once you've got a heavy enough load on your back, it's kind of impossible not to brace. I think that's what a lot of powerlifters are probably experiencing, like these really advanced squatters who are squatting 300 kilos plus or more than triple body weight. Like, how could you not be braced unracking triple body weight? Yes, sure, you can Valsalva on top of that, but there is just going to be so much reflexive bracing. So you'll note that I said we want to maintain a relatively rigid torso, but I did not say that we need to maintain either a neutral, extended, or flexed torso. Just like every other variable I've mentioned today, this exists on a continuum and is individualized for every single lifter. Other than just experimentation, I would say that general rules are a more flexed torso is going to help people with depth. A more extended torso is going to help people limit depth and maybe produce a little bit more total force. Again, at the extremes of these continuums, you might experience it going the opposite way. For example, people who manage to really extend their spines, often it's not the best for force production. You know, it's like a more subtle spinal extension, or especially a more even one. You'll notice a lot of people, they only extend through one part of their back, and often that doesn't really transfer force well, or it doesn't maintain as a brace for a lot of people. Okay, so anytime you have an appreciable amount of load on you, there's some degree of reflexive bracing just from all the muscles on your torso stiffening up a little bit when they sense that load. The Valsalva maneuver allows us to add additional pressure to that brace. Also, where we try to put that air can push us into either more flexion or extension as well. But all a Valsalva is by definition is just trying to breathe out while your tongue is blocking the airway. So you have to have at least a little bit of air in the system, can't be completely empty. Where a lot of people get confused is they assume that this means you need a bigger breath of air to get a stronger Valsalva. I don't think that's the case for a lot of people. Another very individualized thing. Some people get a really strong Valsalva with just a little sip of air. Some people, they need a little bit more air to create that strong Valsalva response. Also, a lot of people who prefer a more stacked ribcage position or who don't extend as much, they might find if they try to take in too high of a volume of air, it changes their axial skeleton orientation. Having said that, if you want more extension through that region, maybe a bigger volume of air is actually what you're looking for. So again, individualized, goal dependent, different for everyone. How many times do I have to say that? There'll still be some idiot out there that watches this video and they're like, one way to squat. And really, you just seem uncultured. You haven't watched enough people squat. Another misconception is that for a strong brace, you have to breathe into your belly. This has never really made sense to me because to me, that's just the path of least resistance. If anything, we should be trying to drive air everywhere but but our belly, or this like opening in our rib cage. To me, this is just the least stable part of our entire axial skeleton. Everywhere else has just so much stability provided by the passive structures, whereas this is just all soft and only has softer connective tissue and muscle to sort of keep it all together. Or to manage the pressure, I guess. So most of my bracing energy, a lot of the time, is put into here and then trying to send the air into all the other parts of the rib cage. There's just so many people that feel amazing taking a big belly breath though, that I'm just going to trust it works for enough people, that you should just experiment with where you put the air. So it's not wrong to belly breathe, but what I know for sure is that not everyone should be belly breathing when they're trying to brace as effectively as possible. I also mentioned at the start the relationship between the load placement or the bar placement and how that affects our bracing. So if I haven't already said that, more anteriorly loaded encourages more flexion in your brace, more posteriorly loaded, typically more extended bracing position. So just to summarize it, bracing is a lot simpler than people make out. If you're lifting heavy enough, you're going to brace reflexively. The amount of Valsalva you want to emphasize on top of that is entirely dependent on you. How flexed or extended you are, yes, there's a relationship between the amount of depth you're trying to get or the amount of force you're trying to produce, but it's still individualized and you should explore the continuum. Your lungs aren't in your belly. Not everyone needs to be belly breathing to get the strongest brace. Just try putting the air in different places of your ribcage and torso and see what gets you the best results. Even the total amount of brace you might need on top of your reflexive bracing is individualized as well. And then with foot pressure, typically more pressure in the toes limits depth, a little bit better for propulsion, more foot pressure into the heels, a little bit easier to get depth, not as good for force production necessarily. With majority of people, I manage most of the variables by just coaching stance width, toe angle, and heel elevation. I'll be honest, for me with foot pressure, I just try to get people to manage pressure as evenly as possible through their whole foot. I'm not a midfoot guy, I'm not a heels guy or a toe guy, I'm a use all of that stuff. You'll notice that I didn't talk about knees in or knees out, just bend your knees. You'll notice I didn't talk about initiating through the knees, initiating through the hips. I think most people just bend them at the same time or experiment. Some people will do better initiating with knees, some people initiating with hips, and every rhythm and combination in between. In terms of the tempo of your descent, that's something where you can just decide what serves you best. I like, typically with my squat and a lot of the lifters I coach, to coach a little bit of a bounce out of the hole, but if you feel better going really slow and controlled, again, that's totally up to you and what works best for you. One thing I will say, if you enjoy a little bit faster or you want to get a bit of a bounce after the descent of your squat, is that you should initiate the squat a little bit slower, and then if anything, you can always speed up going into the hole. What you don't want to do is start your descent too quick, and then before you're actually at depth, you're sort of trying to slow down, and it just really messes up your recoil out of the hole. So it's either slow and controlled the whole way and not really getting a bounce, or it's initiating slow and then we can speed up as we're going into the hole and get a little bit of an elastic recoil. Squat depth, if you're not a powerlifter, who cares? Olympic weightlifters should probably squat deep just because it helps with the sport, but even there's a lot of really successful Olympic weightlifters that squat pretty high in my opinion. A lot of Olympic lifting coaches just ignore this because they can't sort of fit it into their model, but my training model, everything's pretty individualized, exists on continuums, pretty easy to make sense of it all. Humans are pretty individual. All right, gym's getting pretty crowded. I'm gonna wrap this up. There's probably a little bit more I could talk about when it comes to squatting. But if you enjoy learning about not just science-based, but proper frameworks that genuinely help you individualize coaching for people of different goals, body shapes, whatever the hell it is, check out GPP Level 1 down below. Also, I've got coaching slots available if you need help with your strength and conditioning. If you're not interested in any of that, I've got links for free programs down below. And then YouTube's probably suggesting 2 of my previous videos for you to go and binge. So at least go and binge some of my content. I'll see you in a couple of days with another video.